Pro wrestling legend Kurt Angle was recently on the Joe Rogan Experience, where he talked about his neck injury history and his potential upcoming surgery. Further on in the episode, Angle would go into more detail and essentially elaborate on his current symptoms, which would include atrophy in the arms and in the chest area, as well as being unable to feel his pinkies. He also discussed the types of surgeries that he essentially was in between choosing at this point, which includes a fusion as well as a disc replacement. Since some people may not be too familiar with the anatomy of the neck and why he would present with certain symptoms, as well as the differences between a fusion and a disc replacement, I want to go ahead and focus on that with this video. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my channel. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Nick Gallo and I'm a doctor of physical therapy. And with this channel, I take a look at sports injuries and I go over them so that they're a little bit easier to understand. I also go over what that person essentially should expect when they come to physical therapy, as well as an accurate timetable for them to return. If you like this content and you want to see more of it, please hit that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, because I will be making more videos in the future regarding sports injuries, rehabilitation, and other physical therapy related content. Also, if you have any comments or questions, please leave those in the comment section below. So Angle first goes into his initial neck injury, where essentially he is thrown onto his head during Olympic trials, and he describes this as resulting in essentially 4 broken vertebrae with 2 discs that are pressing onto his spinal cord. He then goes on to talk about how he met with a first doctor, and that doctor essentially told him that he needs to do surgery immediately and he should stop wrestling. Then he goes on and he talks about how he met with a doctor for a second opinion, and essentially this doctor told him that if he waits about 6 weeks, his neck will be partially healed, and then he's going to send a doctor with him to give him 12 shots of Novocaine in the neck so he can compete in the Olympics. So here I have a model of the spinal cord, and so it's important to know that when we're talking about the neck, we're talking about vertebrae known as cervical vertebrae, and there's actually 7 of them, and they are numbered C1 through C7. So C1 actually starts right here, so we go C1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that is actually going to be what we consider the neck, and that's all 7 C vertebrae. When he goes on and talks about how he fractured 4 of them, essentially what he's talking about is just the bones here. So each individual vertebrae is a bone, and you can see that on the sides through here, you have nerves that are exiting the foramen, as well as vertebral arteries. So these are very sensitive areas. If you have a fracture there, it's usually a major emergency. So I think his story about getting 12 shots of Novocaine and then competing after only 6 weeks, I think that they're probably not going to be doing that anymore unless it's in very extreme cases, because it is very, very risky to do that with this particular area. The structures that are located in between each vertebrae here, they are known as the intervertebral discs. So intervertebral, meaning they are in between each vertebrae, and disc, essentially what this is it's a piece of fibrocartilage that's going to provide adequate spacing so that the vertebrae are not right on top of each other, because if they are, you can get something called stenosis, which is a narrowing of this foramen in through here, and that will essentially pinch on the nerve if you have a loss of disc height. But they're there for that reason, to provide adequate spacing for the nerves, as well as so we can move our neck side to side, rotate, all those sorts of ranges of motion. Then as Angle goes into his WWE career, he talks about that he actually fractured his neck about 4 other times, resulting in 5 surgeries. He elaborates a little bit on one of the surgeries where essentially they went in and cut out some of the excess disc material to prevent any compression on the areas that are surrounding it. Anytime somebody is getting a lot of compression to the neck, this can cause the disc material essentially to leave the intervertebral area, and that can either go push directly on the spinal cord, or it can press on these nerves going out on either side. So essentially we know from his initial neck injury, that's what happened. The disc material was already pressing on the spinal cord, but given his chronic history plus other neck injuries, this essentially resulted in more disc material leaving that area, which required surgery to cut it out. Then Rogan asked Angle essentially how he's feeling right now in terms of his neck, and Angle goes into a little bit more detail in terms of his clinical presentation. Angle will then go on and talk about essentially right now how he has bicep weakness in both arms, he has tricep weakness in both arms, and he is unable to feel both pinkies. On top of this, he talks about how there is a section in his chest muscle where there is a divot, and that is all related to his neck. It's important to know that in the clinic, we know that each corresponding level of the cervical spine actually contributes towards an action known as a myotome, and this is a test that we do all the time in the clinic to see what level essentially is being affected. And we can do this for the upper and lower extremity. Upper extremity obviously is for the neck, lower extremity is for the lumbar or lower back. So I wanna go ahead and go over those myotomes real quick so that we essentially can infer what levels are being affected in his case. To test C5 in the clinic, essentially what we're doing is we're having the person abduct both shoulders like this, and we're going to push down and essentially test their strength. If they feel weak, then we know C5 is being affected. In the cases where we want to measure C6, this is for our bicep. So we make them make a bicep muscle like this, and we are testing their bicep strength. For C7, that's where we're going to look at tricep strength. So they're going to go in that tricep extension position, and we're going to see if we can break them there. Then as we look at C8, we want to look at finger flexion. So we're going to have them flex their fingers and essentially see if we can break it there. Finally, for T1, we're going to look at finger abduction. So we'll have the person spread the fingers like this and essentially try to break their fingers to see if we see any sort of weakness. Since Angle is talking about having atrophy in both arms, it's safe to say that he is definitely getting severe compression of the nerves in the neck. He goes on to elaborate specifically for bicep curl, which is flexion of the arm, so that would be C6. He also talks about being weak in tricep extension, so that would include C7. And he goes on and talks about that divot in the chest here. And it's important to know that the pec muscles essentially are innervated by C5 through T1. So we know he's at least getting some compression at those levels, plus he's probably getting some compression throughout some of those other ones. Then he talks about having essentially that numbness in both pinkies here. That we look at the dermatome map, which essentially is a map of the upper extremity showing where a person is going to have sensation affected if they have a lesion to the cervical spine. And that's right on par with what we would see with a lesion to C8. So it sounds like as of right now, based on what he says on the Joe Rogan Experience, that he is getting lesions essentially to C6, 7, and 8 at least. And this is solely due to what he's describing, which is what we would ask in the clinic. We would essentially say, what are your symptoms? Do a formal test, and then essentially make an inference as to what we think is going on. Then he goes on and talks about how he's definitely going to need a neck fusion in 2024, and that's where he and Rogan start to talk about the possibility of a disc replacement. Cervical spine fusion is a very common procedure, and I've seen this a lot in the clinic. Essentially what they do is they're going to take some hardware and they're going to essentially screw in some rods to prevent any excess movement at the neck. Anytime a person is going to lose some of that disc material, and if they have a history of fractures, that area gets a little bit more unstable every time. And so it's possible that at this point, he's just dealing with so much instability that the surgeon essentially is just saying, hey, we need to fuse the entire thing to prevent any more of that excess motion. Rogan then talks about how if you get a cervical fusion, then essentially it's bad for you because you're going to limit your range of motion. And that's on par with what we would see with a multi-level fusion. So let's say we fuse a few vertebrae in through here. These segments are no longer going to move. So what'll happen is over time, sometimes a person is going to keep moving their neck, and the segment above and below is going to move excessively. And so a lot of times what a person will have to deal with is they'll have to extend that fusion a little bit further each time, which can lead to more surgeries. So let's talk about a disc replacement. It's literally just like it sounds. Essentially what they're going to do is they're going to come in and they're going to replace the affected disc. So instead of fusing the segment altogether where the person is no longer going to be able to move that, they're going in and they are replacing the disc material in through here. I've seen a few of these surgeries out in the clinical world, and they actually end up doing pretty well because, like it's talked about in this episode, when you get a disc replacement, you no longer have the restricted motion at that certain segment. So I guess it is possible that Angle could elect for that disc replacement surgery, but a lot of times, if it's a multi-level and there's a lot of instability, then somebody might have to elect to go for that fusion just to prevent that excess movement and essentially the irritation of all the affected nerves and or the spinal cord. And so as of right now, it sounds like Angle is on the fence between one of those two surgeries. If I happen to hear any updates regarding on which one he chooses and his outcomes, I'll be sure to update everybody in the comment section. Also, if you happen to hear anything, please feel free to update me as well. I'll provide a link of some of my other popular playlists in the description here so that if you want to, you can go ahead and click on those if you enjoyed this content. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.